The ships came in summer, when the harvest was still green and the men were in the fields. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, Viking raiders swept across Europe's coastlines and river systems, targeting monasteries, villages, and trading posts from Ireland to the Byzantine frontier. What they did to captured women was not random violence, it was systematic, embedded in Norse law and custom, designed to extract labor, produce heirs, and erase identity. The saga literature and Frankish chronicles agree on one thing: captivity was a fate some women chose, death to avoid. When a coastal settlement fell, the selection began immediately. Older women and small children were often killed on the spot. They had no value in the slave markets of Hedeby or Dublin. Young women and adolescent girls were bound with ship rope, hands behind their backs, and marched to the longships, while their homes burned behind them. One Frankish monk recorded that the screaming could be heard across the water long after the sails disappeared. This was not mere raid and retreat, it was harvest. The journey across the North Sea could take weeks. Captives were kept below deck, chained in rows, given just enough water to survive. Some sources suggest that rape during transport was common, a way for raiders to establish dominance before sail. Others argue it was discouraged to preserve market value. Either way, the voyage itself was a crucible. Many women arrived in Scandinavia already broken, bodies thin, eyes vacant. Once in Norse territory, the law was clear: a thrall, a slave, had no legal personhood. She could not own property, testify in court, or refuse her owner's bed. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, later set the price of a female thrall at roughly half that of a male. Her body was inventory. If she bore a child to her captor, the child was also a thrall unless the father chose to acknowledge it, a rare act that required public ceremony and the consent of his legitimate wife. But some captives were more valuable alive than sold. High-born women, abbesses, noblewomen, merchants' daughters, could be ransomed. The process was theatrical. Messengers would arrive at the family's gate with a lock of her hair, sometimes a finger, and a price. Payment was expected in silver, livestock, or land. If the ransom was refused, she vanished into the household economy of the north. Chroniclers in Francia described mothers who sold estates, entire villages, to buy back daughters. Others never heard from them again. For those who remained, life was labor and violation in equal measure. Female thralls worked the fields, processed wool, cooked and served. At night, many were expected in their owner's bed. Norse custom allowed a free man to take a thrall as a concubine without his wife's permission, though tensions in the household could be murderous. Some sagas describe wives poisoning rival thralls or arranging their sale to distant farms. One saga fragment mentions a woman from Northumbria who bore 3 children to her captor, then killed him with a concealed blade when he freed her eldest son, but not her. She was burned alive in front of the farmstead. There was a term for these women in Old Norse, ambat, a word that meant both slave and sexual servant. The distinction between labor and rape was linguistic, not practical. A 9th century Irish annalist wrote that the Norse took so many women from the coasts that entire villages were left with no women of childbearing age. The demographic wound lasted generations. Conversion to Christianity changed the rhetoric, but not the reality. By the late 10th century, Norse kings began adopting the faith to secure trade agreements and political marriages with Christian Europe. Slavery was rebranded, no longer a proud tradition, but a necessary evil, a way to manage pagans and criminals. Female thralls were sometimes baptized en masse, a ceremony that church records suggest was performed without consent or comprehension. Baptism did not grant freedom. It granted a Christian owner the moral cover to continue. Some women were given to monasteries as donations, pious gifts to ensure a jarl's salvation. These women worked convent kitchens and laundries, technically under the protection of the church, but still unfree, still bound. A few learned to read Latin, a skill that in rare cases allowed them to forge new identities. But most remained invisible, names unrecorded, lives compressed into a single word in a ledger. Ancilla, handmaid. Escape was nearly impossible. Scandinavia's geography, fjords, forests, endless cold, worked against runners. Captured women had no knowledge of the language, no allies, no coin. Runaways who were caught faced mutilation. Ears cropped, noses slit, tendons cut to prevent further flight. One law text specifies that a thrall who fled 3 times could be killed without penalty. The body would be left at a crossroads as a warning. Yet resistance happened. Some women formed networks within households, protecting each other's children, sharing knowledge of abortifacient herbs. A small number managed to negotiate their freedom through years of accumulated trust, or by bearing a son their captor valued. These freed women, leisingi, occupied a liminal status, no longer slaves, but never fully free, still bound to their former owner's family by law and custom. Their children inherited the stain. Not all the evidence is clear. Saga literature was written centuries after the Viking Age, often by Christian authors with political motives. Some scholars argue that the depictions of slave concubinage were exaggerated to emphasize the paganism and barbarism of the pre-Christian North. Others point to skeletal remains. DNA studies of Viking Age burial sites show that many women interred in Scandinavia were of Celtic or Slavic origin, buried without grave goods, their bodies marked by malnutrition and bone stress consistent with hard labor. The bones don't lie. The slave trade itself was industrial. Dublin became a hub where captives from Ireland and Britain were sold onward to Byzantium and the Caliphates. A woman taken from a Northumbrian monastery might end up in a household in Kiev or Baghdad, her origin story condensed to a single line in a merchant's ledger, Puella Anglica, English girl. The erasure was total. By the 12th century, the system was collapsing. The church's growing influence, the centralization of royal power, and shifting economics made large-scale slavery less profitable. Thraldom persisted in remote areas for another century, but the great raids were over. The women who had been taken were now grandmothers, their children and grandchildren woven into the social fabric of the North, their names forgotten, their suffering compressed into footnotes. But the legacy remained. The Norse expansion was built on the backs of captive women, uncounted thousands who were ripped from their homes, stripped of their names and fed into a machine that required their bodies, their labor, their silence. The sagas celebrate the warriors. The grave mounds hold the consequences.